Nearly 500 years ago, a Spanish expedition sailed into the Mar del Sur, the Pacific Ocean. They were traveling into the unknown, and their future was a mystery. The sailors were on a mission to find a route to China. Would they succeed, or would they fail? Would they survive to see their home again? We know it as the Cabrillo expedition. Its flagship, the galleon San Salvador, sailed the Pacific Ocean in 1542. And again, nearly 500 years later, a modern replica of the San Salvador to represent a galvanizing moment in world history. A moment with strikingly different meanings for different people. A moment preserved by Cabrillo National Monument. In 1542, Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo bid his daughter, 2 small sons, and wife Beatriz goodbye. Cabrillo was in his early 40s, a practical, battle-hardened soldier and ship's captain. He was born in Palma del Rio, Andalusia, in southern Spain, and immigrated to the New World when he was about 15 years old. Starting out as a crossbowman, he fought in the Spanish conquests of the places we know as Panama, Cuba, Mexico, Guatemala, and Honduras. Now, he'd be leading an exploratory expedition north, taking his men beyond the limits of the known world. The expedition's 200 men came from nearly every class in the New World. Officers, sailors, soldiers, craftsmen, slaves, 2 friars, and even a few merchants. They were going far away, with luck, all the way to China. The men were bringing great hopes, the hope of becoming rich and providing a good life for their wives and children. But they harbored fears as well.
I think it's pretty natural to ask yourself the question, why would people do this? I mean, we think that about half the people that embarked on that voyage got back alive, and that would not have surprised anyone then. So it's an enormously risky kind of behavior to engage upon.
Every man and every wife knew full well that the odds were that neither he nor his ship would ever be seen again.
If they married a sailor, they knew that their husband would be away a good part of the time. While that husband was away, they would be in charge of the household, they would be in charge of the children, but you knew what the seafaring life entailed.
In this era, it was not just men who went to sea. Boys as young as 7 or 8 years old worked on galleons like the San Salvador as well. The crew will face hardships of most every kind. Fierce storms, hunger, disease, loss of life.
The living conditions aboard the San Salvador would have been totally appalling. There's no privacy and there's no place aboard ship you can get away from the wet. The only guy on that ship who had anything approaching privacy was the captain.
There will be contention and dispute on board, but every man on the ship knows they must work and all pull together in order to simply survive the journey. The risk was tremendous. So why would they do it? Because of the wealth that trade could create. Europeans were making fortunes from the nearly priceless spices of Asia. These were the world's first great global commodities. Peppercorns, cardamom pods, cinnamon sticks, and nutmeg. Spices were literally worth their weight in gold. So the Spanish were desperate to find a faster route to Asia.
It was a pathway to enormous wealth, and that was a fairly typical motivation for people doing things like that.
On June 27, 1542, the flagship San Salvador led the expedition north from Navidad on the Pacific coast of what is now Mexico. There were 3 ships: San Miguel, a 35-foot-long scout boat; La Victoria, the 64-foot supply vessel; and the 74-foot flagship galleon San Salvador, with 100 men aboard. The voyage belonged to the Age of Exploration, a period when scores of European expeditions sailed into the vast emptiness of the world's great oceans. In the decades after Columbus, explorers like da Gama, Cabral, and Magellan made long voyages of exploration, mapping almost the entire world and claiming it for one of the 2 superpowers of the age, Spain or Portugal. Even as Cabrillo sailed largely north along the Mexican coast, he expected to discover a swift passage to China. But unlike the Atlantic, the Pacific was a vast riddle with complex patterns of wind and currents. Cabrillo had only a rough idea of the scale of the world, yet he did have the most advanced technological tool of the age: the galleon.
Well, the ocean-going sailing ship gave Europeans an unprecedented amount of power. It contained 3 elements that made it such a concentration of power and so revolutionary. One of those was the heavy hull that could carry cargo, that could carry enough food for a large crew, survive serious storms at sea, and could sail in light winds, so it could cross thousands of miles of open ocean. The second was seaborne artillery. The third, and ironically the most powerful thing, would be a system of navigation to construct charts, to do surveys, to determine where the dangers were to determine where the wind patterns were, and so forth. But it allowed you to do something else for the first time with fair accuracy, and that is put a line on a map and say, this is mine. That is of immense power. That set in train a chain of events that is unparalleled in human history. And without the navigation, you couldn't have done that.
After a week of sailing, Cabrillo reached Cabo San Lucas, the tip of what we call Baja California. Then, on August 20th, the expedition sailed past the Punta del Engaño. No European had ever sailed this far north in the Pacific. Now, all was new to them. The first people the expedition met in what is now California were the Kumeyaay. Their sustainable way of life is at the core of their culture.
Our people, the Kumeyaay people, we say that we've been here since the beginning of time. Archaeologists have put us back initially 10,000 years, and we had a migratory cycle. In the springtime, we would be by the ocean, gathering shellfish, fish, things like that. Then we would go up into the valleys in later spring, into the summer, into the mountains. In the fall, we would harvest acorns. Many times we would go into the desert in the wintertime. But we wouldn't take everything. We just took what we needed. We practiced land management. We practiced fire science. So this cycle would continue for millennia.
One day, the San Salvador fleet sailed into a protected harbor. Cabrillo wrote, it was a very good enclosed port. The exploration party rode into an unfamiliar shore. As always, there was caution. The date was September 28, 1542. the first time Cabrillo landed in what is now the United States. He called the place San Miguel. Today, it's San Diego. When Cabrillo landed, two parallel worlds temporarily crossed. In the calm, protected bay, Cabrillo's men took the opportunity to go fishing, unintentionally causing a conflict with the Kumeyaay.
If you are going to fish in my territory, you need to ask for permission. They didn't bother to ask. So what happened was there was an armed confrontation.
Surprised and overwhelmed by the attack, Cabrillo's men returned to the ship, several of them wounded. The Spanish had been under specific orders not to fight with the native people unless attacked first. None of Cabrillo's party fired their weapons.
The ships needed water, and they needed food, and they needed to be able to get along with the people, so a peaceful encounter was to Cabrillo's advantage.
2 days later, Kumeyaay people paddled small reed boats out to the shadow of the galleon.
If we look at the San Salvador back then, it was considered the highlight of technology. So for these Kumeyaay to come on the boat, it showed a tremendous amount of courage.
Trying to avoid conflict, Cabrillo received them in peace.
Bajar sus armas.
Iyipiku yankipit niapum na mi. Inyach mau mahaku.
¿Por qué atacar a mi equipo?
Kayu mini wheel guatay.
No queremos la guerra.
Over the next 5 days, contact between the men at the Cabrillo expedition and the Kumeyaay was peaceful. The expedition left San Diego and sailed north, still searching for the Spice Islands. Surely China must now be near. But China did not appear. And now problems began. Violent storms lashed the ships, tearing them apart, ruining food supplies. The ships began to leak badly. The surviving crew members became hungry, sick, exhausted. It was bitterly cold. They could not go on. Cabrillo turned the expedition around and headed south again. They put in for the winter at the Channel Islands off the coast of Santa Barbara. But even here, there would be no respite. On Christmas Eve, 1542, a shore party clashed with a group of Chumash people. Cabrillo raced to the island. But as he reached the shore, he slipped, fracturing a limb. His men managed to get him on the rowboat and took him back to the San Salvador. But in an era before modern medical treatment, he was doomed. Testimony would state Cabrillo's wound quickly became infested with gangrene.
Bartolomé, tú tienes que continuar. Prométeme. Continuarás.
Descanse, capitán. Nosotros continuaremos la búsqueda.
Suam, Pisima, Alevet Aduminis Gratia.
On the 3rd of the month of January, 1543, Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo, captain of the expedition, departed from this life. At his death, he emphatically charged his men not to stop exploring.
they did not stop exploring. Ship's pilot, Bartolome Ferrer, now in command, went out to sea again. They were trying to find a southeast wind, which could only happen with an approaching storm. So they went out into the Pacific in the depth of winter, looking for a storm. They found one. They rode the wild winter winds far to the north. They may have gotten as far as what we now call Oregon, 2,000 miles from where they began. In the spring, the tattered ships limped back to Navidad. They reached port on April 14, 1543. After 9 months, the Cabrillo expedition was over. Cabrillo and his men had gone to sea, risking their lives. They'd gone with high hopes to find a shortcut to China, to trade for spices, and make their families fabulously rich. Very little of that happened. They'd found no passage to China. Roughly half of the men who began the expedition were dead or permanently disabled, and every man who survived the journey returned home in debt. Their captain had died and was buried on a distant island. With the passage of time, the memory of Cabrillo and his expedition faded, but not the significance of his discoveries. The expedition recorded data that was a key to cracking the code of the winds and currents of the Pacific. This discovery made possible the great trading routes to the Far East. For the Kumeyaay, the 6 days of contact with Cabrillo's expedition was a brief moment in time. But in the centuries to come, the impact of European exploration was far more profound.
They came back 200 years later, and this is when they attempted to colonize California. They took over parts of the beach that were Kumeyaay territory, and this started a disruption of our culture. It started to affect the Kumeyays in the mountains, the Kumeyays in the desert. A lot of the things that we would gather, it became more and more difficult to gather these things.
But despite many hardships, the Kumeyaay have endured and maintained their culture to this very day.
Our people are still here in this land. We've been here before, we're here today, and we will be here in the future. Today, there are people from many different cultures who live here. When we learn to not fight, but we learn to celebrate the difference in each other and respect each other, that's when we all truly grow.
Cabrillo's contribution to navigating the Pacific was forgotten for centuries. But then, in 1888, 3 centuries after he sailed, the U.S. Geological Survey created a scientific map of the coast, giving Cabrillo credit as the first European explorer to reach California. Then, in 1892, San Diego observed the 350th anniversary of Cabrillo's landing in the area. This was the beginning of his name becoming recognized far beyond the lands he visited. More places in California are named after Cabrillo than any other person in the state's history. Almost 500 years after Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo sailed the San Salvador, his ship, like Cabrillo himself, made its return to the bright sunshine of the California coast. In 2005, the National Park Service and the Maritime Museum of San Diego began the ambitious project of recreating his flagship.
I think our goal in building the San Salvador was to have this physical object that people could step aboard and understand a time that they would otherwise not be able to have any comprehension of.
I have watched adults just standing there, looking at the rigging, thinking about what it would be like to climb up there and have to deal with the sails. There is something magical about the real thing.
By creating the ship, we create a space for the story to live. Wherever she ties up, she provides the space. She is a space where we can explore all of those stories, what they mean, and that gives us the opportunity to explore all those different perspectives. So it's a ship that was designed to explore something. It was 500 years ago. It still is.
Cabrillo National Monument, established in 1913, preserves and interprets the history of Cabrillo's voyage, helping us understand past voyages of exploration, their effect on the peoples and cultures encountered, and how those moments in history have shaped the California of today.